How does it happen that a passenger plane and a military helicopter collide with each other less than 800 yards from the runway? These two aircrafts are about to be at the center of nearly 40 years of red flags, complaints, and horrific close calls above Reagan National Airport that's about to come to one horrifying conclusion. What will be the cost of ignoring the warning bells for 4 decades? Let's find out. Here's the story of Flight 5342 and a Black Hawk helicopter, America's newest tragedy. Until this investigation is completed, which could take up to 2 years, even more if legal red tape and lawsuits get dragged out, both aircrafts in question's maintenance records, history, age of production, and all the information we usually focus on will remain sealed. But since this case is not as a result of negligence, mismanagement, or error on the pilot's or the airline's end, well, that information isn't as relevant as it usually would be in the case of a crash. No. We're afraid to report that this was a tragedy of a completely different nature. But here's what we do know at least. The passenger jet containing American Eagle Flight 5342 was operated by PSA Airlines, and they took off from Wichita, Kansas at Dwight D. Eisenhower Airport on the 29th of January 2025 at 5:18 CST. They were due to land in Washington, D.C. at Reagan National Airport around 9 o'clock that same evening. Manning the yoke was Captain Jonathan Campos, aged 34, and First Officer Samuel Lilly, 29 years old. Both pilots had spotless records, and Campos had accumulated an impressive 3,000 flight hours during his time in the air. Since this was a relatively short domestic flight, there were only 2 stewardesses on board to serve the 60 passengers. They were Denasia Elder and Ian Epstein. Some of the passengers were returning from the U.S. Figure Skating Championships in Wichita, the youngest athlete being Lydia Livingston, who was just 11 years old. Her older sister, 14-year-old Everly, was competing alongside Lydia. Older by just a few months were 2 other 11-year-olds, Sean Kay and Angela Yang, who just won the gold. The skating duo were best friends on and off the ice, and they couldn't wait to bring back their medals to show to their family and friends the proof of their outstanding performance. There were 7 other figure skaters, all between the ages of 11 and 16, accompanied by their parents and 2 coaches, former Olympic skaters Vadim Naumov and Yevgenia Shishkova. Also present were 7 men aged between the ages of 30 and 45, returning from a hunting trip. 5 of the gentlemen had wives and children waiting for them to come back home to talk about their successful boys' trip. At 8:30, there were 2 other aircrafts in the air at the same time that 5342 was. One was Flight 3130, and though not affected by the crash directly, it is important to the events that transpired on that night. Flight 3130 was in the process of leaving Reagan National Airport. The third plane was a military Sikorsky H-60 helicopter, also known as the Black Hawk chopper. Since this was just a procedural training flight, it was manned only by 3 military personnel. 39-year-old Chief Warrant Officer Andrew Lloyd Eves was leading the training exercise for Staff Sergeant Ryan Austin O'Hara and Captain Rebecca Lobach, both 28 years old. Now, moving on, we need to look a little closer at Reagan National Airport. First of all, Washington, D.C. has some of the most congested airspaces on the planet. The sheer amount of aircrafts flying over that city requires a strict schedule and pinpoint planning and accuracy with elevation and speed. There just isn't room for even a few feet discrepancy when navigating this airspace, and flight navigators who work at Reagan have some of the highest stress levels of all air traffic controllers globally. There is no room for error. Absolute focus and control of that airspace is pivotal to keeping the thousands of people coming and going from that city every day safe, especially since most of the airport's surrounded by the Potomac River. If a problem occurs in the air and there's no landing strip available, well, the only 2 options left are to reroute completely or go into the water. Furthermore, the Potomac River is also often the space for smaller military aircraft, like helicopters for instance, to use as a training field. Now, you'd think that this airspace wouldn't need any more traffic, but in reality, smaller aircrafts, helicopters in particular, fly low and slow enough that they can rely on sight navigation, meaning that they merely need to see what's in front of them to avoid any collisions, which is also highly unlikely, since passenger planes will be flying much higher than the helicopters are, unless they're coming into land or are in the process of taking off from the runway. Sort of like driving a car in a busy intersection. Passenger planes fly much higher and much faster, making relying on sight impossible. No human can react to an upcoming obstruction and maneuver a heavy body like a passenger plane going at breakneck speeds fast enough. So air traffic control keeps every passenger plane on a strict flight path to keep collisions from happening, as well as warning military aircraft of planes that are landing or rising. With all that being said, there's one more thing we need to mention. We're about to play you guys some recordings from communications between air traffic control and the two aircrafts that were about to land. The Black Hawk is referred to by the name PAT-25, and the passenger jet, Flight 5342, is referred to as Blue Streak. Now, nicknaming aircrafts is a perfectly regular occurrence just to save time, instead of having to ramble off every plane's number and model every time. So just keep the names PAT-25 and Blue Streak in mind as we go forward. Flight 5342 approached the runway from the south side of the airport, heading towards runway 33, where it was directed to land by air traffic control. It was around 8:45 in the evening, so besides the lights of the airport, the city, and other aircrafts, they would have been almost entirely reliant on air traffic control to direct them. 5342 had just entered its most critical state before landing, by going down to 400 feet in altitude as it approached the runway. Air traffic control gives them the all clear to land without hesitation.
Blue Streak 5307, keep rolling out to November, ground 47 today.
At the same time that 5342 gets ready to land, the Black Hawk approaches and requests to land.
JS 789, contact Don't Mark today. Okay. American 3130, slow the funnel.
Well, American 3130.
Pat 25, traffic just off the Wilson Bridge to CRJ at 1,200 feet, start runway 33.
Scott has a traffic in sight, request visual separation.
This separation proof. American 1630, tower runway 1, lock void, traffic throughout, start runway 33, dispatch 16 on funnel.
Runway 1.
A few seconds later, traffic checks in with the Black Hawk, telling them to keep an eye out for a CRJ and to go behind the CRJ to allow them first access to land. A CRJ refers to the model of the aircraft that's about to come in for a landing too. The Black Hawk gets back to air traffic, telling them that they have the CRJ in their sights.
Pat 25, get the CRJ in sight. Pat 25, pass behind the CRJ.
Scott has a aircraft in sight, request visual separation.
This separation.
The only problem is, the Black Hawk is focused on the wrong plane. They've only got lights to follow, and the lights they focused on belongs to Flight 3130, which is at the moment flying away from the airport. If the Black Hawk did see Flight 5342, they probably assumed that it was at a higher elevation than 400 feet and just kept going straight ahead, expecting them to fly safely over them. The dark night sky, combined with the city lights, could very likely have distorted the pilot's visual cues, making the plane look like it was farther away or at a different altitude than it really was. The pilots on board 5342 had their eyes on the fast approaching runway, whose signal lights were already visible to them less than 800 yards ahead of them. Trusting traffic control to keep their path clear, they wouldn't even see that there was another body in the sky, until it hit them, that is. Air traffic control was in the process of directing other flights when they heard this.
American 4782 by BAT, now for visual.
American 472, watch star 1 star 32017.
Alright, this is Win.
And then chaos descended on the radios as everyone tried to figure out what happened over the Potomac River, and one controller had the sense to call emergency services through the mad scramble as everyone tried to get organized.
Crash. This is Alert 3. Crash.
This is alert 3. Crash, crash, crash. This is alert 3. Oh, shit.
Where's the alert 3?
It is off the approaching the runway 33. Approaching the runway 33. Helicopter crash.
Helicopter. Copy out this morning.
Crash, crash, crash. This is alert 3. 2 helicopters. Helicopter CRJ approaching the runway 33. The approaching runway 33, a mile off final. Crash, crash, crash. Kilo CRJ approaching the 33.
Okay. How many souls on board?
We don't have any of that information. Towers reporting a CRJ and a helicopter crash in Potomac River.
It only took 3 minutes from the time of the crash to a complete halt on all operations, so that the airport could clear all points of entry for emergency services to enter when they got there. This is probably the fastest an airline has responded to any crash we've covered on this channel thus far. Now, with all that going on, the radio communications can sound chaotic to us listeners, but they actually got organized and set actions into motion as fast as is humanly possible under those circumstances.
Can we go ahead and hold all operations till we have emergency units respond? We're going to go ahead and show the aerodrome closed.
Yeah, that's affirmative. Hold all operations, aerodrome closed.
And everybody just hold your positions, please, on the field right now.
South 43, ready for taxi.
Everyone's going to have to hold for down. I'll get back to you just as soon as I can.
Though the responders didn't know it yet, the collision between the two aircrafts happened at approximately 140 miles per hour. Upon impact, 5342 broke into multiple pieces and the Black Hawk's tail snapped off. Both aircrafts were on fire and dropped into the river, 5342 in several pieces, and the Black Hawk landed upside down. If anyone survived the initial collision, which is highly unlikely, they were doomed the moment they sank down 8 feet into the Potomac River, because they'd all have been strapped into their seats and at best been alive but unconscious. And in the 10 minutes it took for the first of the responders to arrive, no one would have been able to survive the freezing water for that long. It took them another 15 minutes for the first vessels to fight the ice on the water and the wind buffering them before they could even reach the site at all. There were a total of 67 souls that went down that day. There were no survivors of this incredibly tragic event. Miraculously, every single one of the lives lost had been recovered and identified. A tragedy that went down simply because of a miscommunication and less than ideal visual conditions. So, while the recovery operations commence and families mourn the loss of so many young lives, we can look into some factors that contributed to what could have been prevented. Both aircrafts were within their designated parameters and elevation requirements after all, so it's not like they were out of their expected bounds. Not on paper, anyway. So let's break this down, starting with Reagan National Airport. It's no secret that the airport's been understaffed for years now, and near misses at Reagan Airport are nothing new. Since 1988, there have been 26 reported cases of passenger planes nearly crashing into helicopters that use the area for training exercises. The last one occurred just a day before the crash when another passenger plane was forced to abort landing due to helicopters flying right under their path. And it's always the same set of events. A plane is getting ready to land or is in the middle of takeoff, and that lower altitude puts them in the direct path of a helicopter passing by. So, helicopters flying lower than the passenger planes makes no difference during landing and takeoff. Simply put, this isn't the place to have military training of any Army aircraft. The airways are just too congested to allow it. Not to mention the fact that there aren't enough air traffic controllers to oversee everything that's going on all at once. On the night of the crash, only one air traffic controller was in charge of no less than 4 aircrafts coming and going, as well as that Black Hawk flying over the river. According to protocol, there should have been 2 controllers managing that amount of aircraft, and we still think that that wouldn't have been enough. Then there's the fact that this all went down in the evening. Normally, these drills are scheduled to happen after 9:30 when air traffic slows down somewhat, but the Black Hawk was allowed to arrive half an hour early. The military were very much aware of this allowance after 9:30, yet they pushed their luck by half an hour, hoping to wrap up training just a little earlier. And finally, the pilot of the Black Hawk simply misunderstood the instruction. He was told to fly behind Flight 5342, but he mistook the flight in question for the departing Flight 3130. If you look closely, you can see Flight 3130 in the upper right-hand corner just moments before the collision occurred. Sure, you can blame the flight controller for not being clear enough, but then again, he shouldn't have been the only person to manage that section of the airport all by himself. Can one person really be expected to keep 5 separate aircrafts in order? No, the flight controller isn't the only one to blame here. These men, women, and children all died because the airport was understaffed and military aircrafts shouldn't have been flying there at that time at all. Quite frankly, it's a miracle that this hasn't happened before. The alarm bells have been going off since 1988, if the piles of close calls and incident reports are anything to go by. 37 years of red flags, and no one listened. And now, 67 people, a lot of them not even in high school yet, were lost to the world before they could even have a chance to grow up. Undoubtedly, there are still many years of lawsuits and empty promises for change and restructuring still ahead before we have all the answers. But in the meantime, remember the victims' faces, the fathers, mothers, athletes, and veterans, the active servicemen and women, a civil rights attorney, teachers, and most tragically, all of the 12 children. And remember their families, because no matter who is to blame, the world will still forever be without all 67 of these people. Nothing can change that heartbreaking fact now, can it?